Hello and welcome. Hi, I'm Dave. This tutorial is part of a beginner CSS series. I'll be using the Chrome web browser, the Visual Studio Code editor, and the live server extension for Visual Studio Code to view the web page. There are links to these tools, starter code files, and all resources in the description below. Let's move on to CSS typography. And I'm going to paste a definition here. Typography is the way that text is arranged and presented. So today we'll be working with text and font in our CSS. Now you can see I've got a CSS folder with a style.css file, and I have an index.html file today. I'll save the style.css file, and for the index.html file, let's just take a quick look. We've got a basic web page here, and inside the body of the web page, we have a header element and we have a main element. Inside the header element, we have an H1, and inside the main, we have a paragraph, and then we have a simple form. And our form has a label, input, and button. We'll be working with all of those today. Let's go back to the style. I'm also going to press Ctrl B to hide the file tree. And now I'm going to resize VS Code here so it's only on the left of our screen. And on the right, we'll have our web page. And I'm using the live server extension, so any changes we make in the CSS will show immediately over here in the web page. You can see the simple web page that we just went over in VS Code. It's got our H1, it's got our paragraph with some lorem ipsum text, and it's got our simple form here with the label, input, and button. I'm going to start our CSS by selecting the body, and inside the body I'm just going to set a padding of 25%. And if you remember the CSS box model, setting padding of 25% sets that on all sides, top, right, bottom, and left. So you can see it put our text right here kind of in the middle of the page, not exactly centered, but it lets us work with it and see it in that regard. Now, we've covered a few things about text and font already in this series, and one of those was setting the font size. And we already know we want to let the browser set the default font size, so that enables the user to make a choice as far as their settings, and it also helps accessibility. And then when we do set a font size, like I'm about to here on the body, we want to use root EMs. That is referencing the root's font size, or that default font size that the browser sets, which is usually defaults to 16 pixels. So if I say 2 root EMs here, REM, this will probably set it to about 32 pixels. And there you can see we have a much larger font size. And now I can see the padding's a little too large for what I want to do, so I'll put this back to 10%, and there. It's kind of in the part of the page where we'll see it the best, and we'll be able to reference the different things we're going to do to the text and font today. Now also notice, and we learned this as well in the past, that through inheritance, font and text settings are usually inherited. So the children of this body element would inherit the font size of 2 rems unless we set a specific one on those child elements. However, they do not inherit the size here inside of a form. So notice the label has that font size inherited, but it did not get inherited in the input or the button. So after the body here, we could also select both the input and the button, and then inside of this we could say font and inherit, and now they will both inherit that font size that we put on everything else. One other thing we've already learned is that we can change the color of the different text on our page, and we can just do that through the color property. So I'll change this to purple so it's a noticeable change. We can see everything changed here to purple. I really don't want to do that today, but it is one of the things we've already covered. So I'm going to remove that, but now we do know how to change the different colors of our text on the page. Now I want to go ahead and remove this form as we're not going to use it for the rest of the tutorial. So just quickly back inside of the index.html, I'll select the form, and I can press Shift Alt and the letter A to just comment that form out so we don't see it on the page, but it's still there in the source code if we want to go back to it. And we can do the same here inside of our CSS. So I'll highlight the input and the button style, press Shift Alt and the letter A, and VS Code will comment out the style in the CSS. So we've removed it essentially from our HTML and CSS, but it's still there to reference if you want to go back and work with form elements. Now when I'm speaking, sometimes I will say font when I mean text, but they are really two different things. Notice I'm creating a little extra space here in our CSS. So we have some text settings that aren't impacted by the font choice at all. And let's go over those first. So let's select our paragraph here on the page, and we'll set some text settings for that. And the first one we should go over is text-decoration. And we can see the different choices we get right away when we choose text decoration, because VS Code wants to help us. One typical text decoration to set would be underline. So let's go ahead and save this. And now we can see our full paragraph text is underlined. Another choice, which is just the opposite, is overline. And when we set that, you can see now we have a line above the text instead of below it. And then there's also line dash through. And if we save that, it does exactly what you expect it to. It puts a line through the text. Maybe you just have a few words you want to cross out, and you surround those words in a span element, and then you set this line through property for that specific span element. And that would probably be a class you would create to do that. So after we've gone over those text decoration settings, the other one you may see is none. Now that is the default for a paragraph text like this, but what if you had a link text? Links are usually underlined by default, and so setting none would remove the underline on a link. And those are the typical settings. I'm not going to go over every setting today because there are so many for text, but I'll go over the most common. The next text setting we'll look at is text transform. And after that, you can see our selections pop up here in Visual Studio Code again. So if we choose capitalize and save, now it capitalized the first letter of every word in our paragraph. Likewise, we could choose lowercase, and now every letter is lowercase, not just the first letter, but every letter. And then we could choose uppercase, and we'll get the opposite as well. And now we have all uppercase. Okay, now after text transform, another very common text setting is text align. What we normally have is align left. So this is typically the default for paragraphs. And you see this, and look to the right. This is not uniform over here. Each line has kind of a different ending point. And this is how we typically see a paragraph when we're looking at a paper or something like that, like a school paper. However, a newspaper might choose to justify, or a magazine, paragraphs. And now notice the right-hand column is uniform here, where it all ends at the same place, just like the left side does. And then, of course, we can text align right, which is the opposite of text align left. And now it's uniform on the right, but it is not on the left. And sometimes when we write a paragraph, we want to indent that first line. So let's remove this and save so you can see the default setting. So here's our paragraph. We have no indent up here at all, but we can choose text-indent, and here's a good spot to use EM units. So I'll say 2EM and save. And now we have an indent of 2 M's, that's EM units, and it just indents that first line. Of course, we can set it to a bigger number, and you can see it go over even further, so you can really see it go into action. However, 2 seems about right here. So if we need to indent that first line, we can do that with text indent. And of course, there are more text settings that you can pull up as well, and refer to MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network, where they have great documentation for all of these. Another way to find out about text properties besides MDN is to just type text, and then you can see Visual Studio Code start to make suggestions here for some other settings you may want to look up, but I've gone over the ones that I believe are the most commonly used. Okay, I'm going to save again so we get back to the default for our paragraph, and there's a few other properties that impact typography that do not start with text or font. So let's quickly go over those. And one is line height. Line height accepts units just like we went over in our unit and sizes tutorial. So we could use different percentages and things like that. However, it also just accepts a number. And the default is usually right around 1.2. So we probably won't see much of a change to our paragraph when I set the line height to 1.2. However, it starts to look much better around 1.4 or 1.5. So I'll go with 1.5, And I think that really increases the readability of our paragraph. Not that I can read Latin, but just the line height increase here made a big difference. So I'll go ahead and cut this and save, and you can compare. See how it looks much more crowded, and it's a little more jumbled to my eyes at least. But if I paste this in and save, that would make it much more readable, especially at a distance, and on a screen sometimes my eyes get weary, so I believe that helps. Okay, I'm going to leave line height there because I believe that does help the readability, but I'm also going to add letter dash spacing, and this does exactly what you'd think it would do. It increases the space between the letters of the word. So if we put in, let's go with 1M and save, it really spaces those letters out, doesn't it? We probably don't want to stick with that unless we're going for some kind of special effect. Maybe down to 0.25. Well, it's definitely more readable, but it looks kind of weird to me still. Maybe 0.1. And you may see text like that somewhere, sometime in a heading or something to draw attention to. That looks like it may work, but I wouldn't use letter spacing too often because it seems normal to me when it's just at the normal setting presented by the browser. And in addition to letter spacing, there is word spacing. So let's go with 2M there and notice the difference. It really spaced those words out. So we could come back maybe 0.5. And yes, we've got some extra space between the words. Once again, it's an effect more to me than it does anything to really increase the readability. However, maybe if we got to a much smaller size, maybe it would help. Let's see. Well, it's noticeable still. I don't know if I like it better, but it is an option. So we have letter spacing and word spacing. But I do believe increasing the line height just a little bit from the default that's around 1.2 to more like 1.4 or 1.5, depending on the text you're working with, could really help that readability. Okay, moving on to some font properties now that actually start with the word font. And I can put in a dash, and let me do that again. Put in a dash, and Visual Studio Code starts to suggest some things. The first one it does is font size, which we've already gone over. Let's skip font family for now and go to font weight. So for the font weight, that's essentially whether it's bold or not, and normal, or the default, is right around 400. So if I save this, we won't notice much of a change. Well, I noticed a bit of a change. Let's see what 300 is like. And yeah, maybe normal was more like 300 for this particular font, but overall, 300 to 400 is kind of normal. Let's go back and see what Visual Studio Code offers for values that we could choose from. So now you see we've got 100 through 900, 900 being very bold and 100 being not bold at all. And then there's also just some words we could choose: bold, bolder, lighter, and then of course normal. So let's go with normal and see what that looks like. Well, normal looks more like what we had at 400 there. Let's go with lighter and save. And it's not too light, but it's noticeably lighter than it was. Let's go with bolder. And that's very bold. We can definitely see the difference there. So 100 would be very light, and 900 would be very bold. And if you don't set the font weight, you can expect it to be somewhere right around what normal was to begin with. Now let's look at font dash style. And if we set font style, we're setting possibly the italic setting. And if we save, that's exactly what you would expect. We have italic text. There's also oblique, which essentially is a stronger italic. It just has a little bit more emphasis there. And as you might expect, after learning about font weight, it also has a normal setting. So that is the default, and it's basically that without setting a font style as well. Okay, now we get to the big settings, something we typically set not on an individual paragraph unless we want to change the font specifically for the paragraph, but let's set this on the overall body of the page. And this is the font family property. Notice Visual Studio Code is providing lots of suggestions here that we'll go over in just a minute, but there are some main generic families, and one is serif. And if I save, it's pretty much what the browser default already was. And this is the type of font family that we see in academic papers, newspapers, papers you'd see in school overall. However, on the web, it's much more popular to use the sans serif family. If I save that, you can definitely see the change here. And this text is more like you would see on many popular web pages, even though there may be variations of. Then another generic family is monospace. Oops, I didn't spell that right. I need monospace. There we go. And if I save that, you can see monospace has the same spacing for every character. So this looks much more like an old typewriter or something like that, where it gives each character equal spacing. Then there is also the cursive family. And that looks a little different as well. You may have seen fonts like that before. And I believe there's the fantasy family. Save that, yes, and that also looks different. Here, I would possibly think about using just a little bit of letter spacing. It looks a little crowded to me. But overall, those are the generic families. But those are usually used as a fallback because we have more specific fonts that make some changes. So when Visual Studio Code was suggesting these font family values, let's go with this first one we see here, Courier New, and then Courier, and I'm going to press Alt-Z so the code wraps over here on the left. So you can see this full font family setting. So Courier New is the first choice. And then the second choice is a fallback. So if our computer, whether it's Windows, Mac, or whatever, and they do have different fonts installed, if our computer doesn't have Courier New, then it's going to look for Courier. And finally, after that, it's going to look for monospace. So it doesn't necessarily use all three. It uses the first choice if available. If not, it uses the second choice, and if not, the third. Also notice that Courier New has a space in it, and anytime the font name has a space in it, you need to put quotes around the name to handle that spacing. The names that don't have a space do not need any quotes at all. So let's save this, and here we are using Courier New, I believe, on the page, which looks a little different. Now let's choose something else from a different font family. So we had the monospace family right there. Let's go with Arial, and you can see Visual Studio Code instantly suggests a full font stack, which is what these are when you have multiple choices. This suggests Arial, then Helvetica, and then finally the sans serif generic family. So let's save that. And this is a font you see much more often on the web overall, and Arial is fairly commonly installed on both Mac and Windows, and probably Linux, any other type of computer. Okay, after that, maybe Verdania is another one in that sans serif family you would see. And here, this font stack has 4 choices actually. Verdania, Geneva, Tahoma, and then eventually sans serif. Also notice that sans serif does not need quotes around it because it has a dash. It does not have any spaces. So if we save that, this looks just a little bit different than when we had Arial. Now if we did want to choose a serif font instead of a sans serif font, a very popular one is Times New Roman, and you can see the suggestions here from VS Code. We've got Times New Roman in quotes again, then Times, and then serif. So if we save that, this is more like what the default browser font looked like. And I've got a couple of good links about what are called Websafe fonts, and that's essentially what is being suggested here by Visual Studio Code. When you use these stacks, they're fairly web safe. They don't need to be installed from an external source. Typically, the computers would already have these available to the browser. I'm going to switch this back to Arial, choose that and save, and I'll leave the page like this now. Okay, I'm going to grab the browser and take it to full screen now. And now that we're there, I'm going to go to my next tab, which is fonts.google.com. And now we're going to choose an external font from Google Fonts. And this is a very common practice, and we can load this in and then use it on our page. So here's a very popular font, Roboto. So we can select it, and it says it has 12 different styles. So now it takes us to the Roboto page, and you can see the different styles. Notice this says thin 100 here for this style. Now this means that font weight is 100 essentially. Here's light 300 italic. So you can choose some of the styling right here at Google Fonts. I typically choose not to and just get a generic font and then try to apply my own styles as well. But you can see the different ways the font will appear, and that's really nice to look at like that. So I would typically just choose the regular 400 and see if I could modify it with my own CSS. Now there are different ways we can link to this. Google Fonts lets us choose a link that we can put in the head element of our HTML, or it lets us choose an import. Let's look at the link version first. So if I were to do that, I would be choosing this link section here. Now it says I have more than one link selected. So I previously had selected another font here. I'm going to click the minus symbol and remove it. So I only have Roboto. And now there's still this link section. I would need to copy all of this, and then I would do that with Control C, for example. Now I would need to go back to my code. So let's do that. And here inside of the code, I'm going to need to go to the HTML, and then let's make this take up the full screen for a little bit. And inside of the HTML, in the head section, before the link to my style sheet, because it needs to use the fonts, I need to paste in these extra link elements that Google provided. So it's going to get the information from Google Fonts, load it in, and then my style sheet can read it. But although we're loading it in here, we're not quite finished because we haven't applied it to our CSS, so they will not be used yet at this point. I'll drag this back over, and now Google is also saying we need to apply this line in our CSS to use it. Notice Roboto has a sans serif fallback, so it's part of that font family. I'll copy that, go to the CSS, and where I had Arial, Helvetica, and sans serif here, I will replace it with what Google suggested and provide Roboto and sans serif. Now note, they put quotes around Roboto, and that won't hurt anything either, so we'll leave it as they suggest. And now let's go back to our document, and notice we're using the Google font Roboto now. Now you can choose more than one font from Google as well. The more you attempt to load in from Google though, the longer your page will take to load. So I suggest grabbing no more than you absolutely think is necessary. I do want to show you how to use the import in your CSS instead of the link in your HTML. So let's click the @import here, and now you can see it's not quite as much code. And what else I like about this is it goes right in your CSS if you want it to. Notice they put it between the style element, which could still go inside of the head of your HTML if you were to copy all of this. I'm not going to select the style element tag, the opening or closing, just what's in between, because I'm going to put this directly into my CSS file. So now that I've copied the @import statement, I would normally put it right up here at the top of my CSS, and you want it before it would load anything in. Now, of course, this is wrapping the code because it's a longer line with the URL, but I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back to the HTML, and I'm going to remove all of those links that we had, of course, leave our own style sheet, and now we'll still be able to use the Roboto font. Even though I've removed those links from the head section of the HTML, I now have the import statement at the top of my CSS. And if I go back to our document, I can even reload, and we still have the Roboto font ready to use because we've imported it at the top of the CSS. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.